opening, motion's been made, seconded, and voted to open this hearing. This is a public hearing as authorized under Chapter 48, Section 5 of the Massachusetts General Bylaws to take testimony and input on a zoning bylaw for large-scale industrial and commercial facilities within the town of Ashfield. Before we get started, there's a sign-in sheet. If you haven't signed it, I believe it's in the back now. It was traveling around earlier, or it's traveling around very good. Is there also one in the back? Try to make sure you put your name on one or the other. This hearing is being recorded by a digital recorder up here and apparently a video recorder off there on stage right. We are probably, because this is Passover today, we are probably going to continue this hearing to next Wednesday, so those people who couldn't make it today have an opportunity to come. When we got to scheduling this hearing, we were afraid of snowstorms. We decided to start it today, with Wednesday being our snow day, but we can now spread it out over 2 days. So I think probably most of the people in the room understand the gist of this bylaw. I would like to know if anybody here would like me to read it out loud. Thank you. And Alan would like to add a couple
Just
things.
Logistics, because it's being recorded. Many of you know this. If you're giving comment, please state your name clearly for the record, and even if you're commenting again, state your name. And also in the back, there should have been copies of the draft bylaw. If there are none left back there, there's some in the box up here. If anybody wants them, there should be some in the back. There's also some up here in this box.
Can the people at the front table please introduce themselves?
Yes, we're getting to that. Thank you. Ken Miller, on my right is planning board member. Alan Rice is planning board member and our clerk. I am Michael Fitzgerald, chairman of the planning board. This is Jim Cutler on the planning board member, and our clerk recently, our scribe recently retired with health issues, and this is Victoria Marsteller, who's filling in today for Megan, who's no longer with us. This bylaw is an answer to the public resolution from June 2014 that the town come up with something to allow citizens to have hearings, make motions, and vote on any kind of large-scale infrastructure proposal in Ashfield. And in particular, as a practical matter, this is about the pipeline. It might be about wind turbines, it might be about other large things, but to try to give the town of Ashfield more control over projects of that sort when they should come to town. We are here today because the select board has a schedule where they have asked us to hold a hearing. They're hoping to bring this to town meeting for the annual town meeting in May, and we are within the deadlines with this hearing and with whatever our recommendation is going to be after this hearing for this to go to town meeting. At this point in time, the planning board is unanimous that this bylaw needs more work before it goes down to town meeting, but we will not object if it goes to town meeting, because you guys have a right to vote on stuff. But we see a number of things in here that we think need more consideration and editing before we can put our minds behind actually recommending it. With that in mind, having said that, I'd like to open the floor to questions, comments, anybody that wants to testify. This is important testimony. It's your opinion about this bylaw, one way or the other. It will all be recorded and become part of public record. So who would like to start off?
Ted Murray, 111 Strohecker Road. Could you say more about the things that you think need further refinement in this bylaw?
Unfortunately, we have failed, and I mean that with a capital F, to get much beyond the vote that we all have reservations. I can, and I'm prepared to, tell you what my reservations are. Alan, I think, has some reservations that he's prepared to speak of. Rick Chandler, who couldn't be here today, might speak about his reservations, which might be somewhat separate from ours. So with that in mind, I'll tell you what mine are. And it's very complicated. I actually had to do quite a bit of work to figure out what I was really thinking here. But if you'd asked me 5 years ago if we had any power over utility companies in town, I would have said no, not really. I've worked with utility companies in my professional career. When you have a utility company on your job site, it's like having a bulldozer driving around without a driver. They do what they want. They show up, they dig a hole without telling you. They have this eminent domain power, and that's what they act like, and they've gotten worse over the years. If it clearly says in our enabling legislation that zoning is exempt, that they are exempt from zoning controls. So to pass a zoning bylaw to attempt to regulate utilities is a long shot. However, I've noticed that we actually do have a lot of power over them over the last few years. Every person that refuses to sell them their rights adds legal costs under an eminent domain. Every time we pass an inconvenient law such as this one, and I have no doubt that this one would give them a lot of inconvenience, they have to at least research what the local regulations are and respond to it. And we can increase costs with our protests. There's been a number of large-scale infrastructure projects in my lifetime. The first one I remember was I was very little when the power lines went through, and they went through without much hitch. There was the towers in Hawley that the military wanted to put in, and they went away because people just merely protested and organized. There was the wind turbines on Ridge Hill that went away because people protested and organized. This one went away largely, I think, for economic reasons. I think a big reason this one went away is that Boston doesn't need the gas that they pretended they needed. And that's because of conservation, it's because of alternative energy, and it's because of a lot of what the public across Massachusetts is doing. The danger we face today is that Eastern Massachusetts may need more energy at some point in the future, and another pipeline proposal might happen. Concurrently with that is the price of gas is so low right now that they can't pay for the pipeline anyways. If the price of gas goes up, and it will go up if we stop doing alternative energy and conservation and the things that we've been doing, then we might have this sort of thing come back to us. I haven't seen a legal success over the pipeline. What I've seen is an economic success and political success over the pipeline. And I'm not sure that this bylaw will give us a legal success over them if they really want to locate here. In 2014, we made a resolution that the people of Ashfield should be able to hold public hearings and make motions to vote on all corporate state in federal energy infrastructure and other large-scale projects within the town as they arise. I do not see anything in this bylaw that increases our ability to make motions and vote on large-scale infrastructure. Right now, the planning board has, and the select board has that right, and we retain this right under this bylaw. But it doesn't increase our ability, it doesn't bring large-scale infrastructure to town meeting. But what I see today is a bylaw that answers the spirit of that resolution rather than the letter. This would undoubtedly have the effect of discouraging large-scale developments from opening in Ashfield. Utility projects encouraged by FERC to try to comply with these regulations might shy away, probably would shy away, from what are additional costs. Other projects, large-scale projects, would have to go through a special permit process as they do now. And once they look at these sort of requirements, which have a very high bar, they're very likely to go elsewhere. On the other hand, if they really are compelled to locate here in Ashfield, we would have to own up to everything that's written in here. And a lot of things that are written in here are not exactly what I'd like to see as planning board chairman if I ever had to hold a public hearing under this bylaw for a large-scale industrial. For instance, it defined a quarter-mile setback for day-to-day operations in here. When we were discussing wind turbines, we were discussing three-quarter-mile setbacks. We would probably be held to this quarter-mile setback if a wind development came to Ashfield. Some of these large-scale developments have deep pockets. So the danger I see is that it gives a clear blueprint for large-scale development. If they can actually afford to do everything that's in this bylaw, then we are kind of going to be required to give them permission to do and come to town, which we might not be able to under our current system. Now, personally, I think the likelihood of a pipeline or another large-scale development in my lifetime actually succeeding under our current or this bylaw to locate in Ashfield is pretty remote. I don't think the energy picture today is such that the pipeline's going to come back anytime soon, especially after what all the organizers did to them last time. They're going to go somewhere else. And we're not very attractive to Walmarts and large-scale development here anyways, because we've been planning successfully for small-scale development for several decades now. So the details of this, of my reservations, I will go through now. Section 1, you can open your copies, and there's a purpose here. In my mind, this purpose needs to refer to the main purpose section of the bylaws of Ashfield. It needs to not paraphrase things that are in that section. So that if I am someday right, or somebody after me, a planning board member, is someday writing a defensible decision, there's no ambiguity between this purpose section and that purpose section. And this purpose section needs to clearly state what are additional purposes over and beyond the purpose section of our main bylaw. I particularly object to C, especially in rural areas and on agricultural lands adjacent to large-scale industrial and commercial facilities. I think that this should apply to all lands in town and not some special place. And if we were to leave that line in there, I would want to see a definition for it. Under definitions, it is purported that this would be included in the definitions section of this section of our bylaws. This needs to be re-lettered so that these definitions go in with the other definitions in our bylaws, as we have with every bylaw revision that we've ever done. In section 3, applicability. This mentions a few things this wouldn't apply to. It says nothing about educational uses. Yet there are some educational uses that we might want this to have some regulation over. Educational uses are also exempt from zoning, but I think some of these could be applied to a major educational use. It says nothing of recreational uses. Is this going to apply to a cross-country ski area that is more than 50 acres? Would this apply to solar, which is a whole other exemption thing? If one of these vacant farms in town wanted to have an outdoor concert, would be required to measure the sound around them, and the neighbors approved and came to a hearing and said that this is all right with them for one weekend, would we have to be measuring the sound for them 6 months beforehand when we already know it's going to be noisy? Under the compliance bylaw, there is an area where it says such special permit shall expire 3 years from the date of issuance if construction is not begun, but they're going to be required to renew every 2 years. Will the planning board be forced to renew an application when construction has not yet begun on a project? I think that needs to be sorted out. Under section 5, pre-application process conferences. I think this is a very good thing. It actually exists in the planning board rules as of now. But if it's going to be added as a bylaw, it should be added to the special permit section and not to this section. It should apply to all special permits. Under the application section, there's a lot of good stuff in here, but not all of the application requirements are in the application section. Some of them are in other parts of the bylaw. The community environmental impact analysis and health assessment, I really like this. And it is mentioned in the application section, and it's a small grammatical thing that I would rather just put this in the application section so that it's clearly part of the application. The professional consultant section. Just last year before last, the state took away our professional consultancy rights by saying that if we didn't write our professional consultant bylaw in a certain way, we would no longer be able to force special permit applicants to pay for consultants. I really want this to be added to the general bylaws and not just to this bylaw, so it applies to all of our special permits. And from what I've seen of what the state is expecting, and I have a copy of that here, they're expecting a definition of a special account and reporting requirements that don't exist in here. And so I'm not entirely sure that this section would be what we want, applying to this section of the bylaw or to some other section of the bylaw. Then, see, I've been in a situation a number of times where we've refused a special permit. And a few times we've gone to court. And I've been coached some by town council on how the judge looks at this. And we have a section in here called design, which is sort of like the criteria section. The judge is expecting me to go down the list of all the criteria that we're going to judge a special permit on, and and say it answers this question, answers that question, it doesn't answer that question. The criteria for this is scattered amongst 3 or 4 different sections, and it should all be in the design section or the criteria section. There's a number of things in here that are post-permit pre-construction. I think we need to have a clear pre-construction section so that we know what the town's expectations are. This isn't just for the developer, it is for the town as well. And we need to, because there's a renewal clause for these permits every 2 years, although, as I said earlier, it shouldn't be every 2 years if the permit's good for 3 years. That needs to be coordinated in my mind. And this is stuff I haven't argued with anybody about yet, including these, especially these guys on the board. They might have much different opinions. We need to have 3 separate areas telling the planning board what the town wants us to do. What do we really want to bring in the application section? What is the criteria we're going to award this on? What are the pre-construction things that we're expecting from the thing after permit goes through? And what is the process going to be for permitting and re-permitting them? Those are 3 separate issues that are not clearly, in my mind, sorted out by this proposal. And then there is, as is often the case at the end, a removal requirements and abandonment section, which is pretty good. But for some reason, back in the design section, there is a reclamation part, which I think needs to be moved to the part at the end about the removal requirements and abandonment, because it's the same thing. Now, and I really like the violations and penalties thing at the end, except that it doesn't mention the building commissioner. The building commissioner is not mentioned here at all, and I would think that the building commissioner would have some input on this and might be the enforcement officer that actually gets these penalties out of the people that are breaking our rules, if that's the case. It might actually be the person that's responsible for long-term inspection, as building commissioner is responsible for long-term inspections on public spaces that need to be re-inspected every year. Might not. I don't know if anybody's talked to the building commissioner. So those are my reservations, and I understand that the select board was expecting the planning board to have thought this all out by now. I didn't personally agree that we could get something like this together. Of course, back when I was asked, I thought we were going to figure out a way to get you all to make motions and votes on large-scale infrastructure, because that's what the original resolution was. But I did agree that there should be somebody studying and writing this stuff up, and I think they've done a very good job. They've come up with some really excellent language that really gets to the heart of this. But I don't think enough planning about other possibilities about outdoor recreation and whether this affects those things has been done. I don't think enough planning has been done about, if we ever have to enforce this bylaw, how easy or confusing will it be for the town and town council and the building commissioners to do that. And those are my opinion. That is why I have a reservation about not the concept of having something like this at all, but whether or not this should be approved today. That being said, you could vote this in and you'd get some protection, and I believe the planning board would keep working on the next draft at town meeting. I believe the select board is sort of planning to move this forward, and it will come up to town meeting. And I might come and say exactly much the same things as I just said about my own reservations about it at that point in time. Yes, Tom?
Ron Kohler, 168 David Road, Ashfield. Just by means of background a little bit for everybody, back in 2014 there was 2 pages of legal jargon on the citizen petition, but in capital letters, there's the following paragraph. Therefore, be it resolved that we call upon our leaders to adopt rules, bylaws, or take other actions as necessary. So, the select board over a year ago started kicking around this notion about a bylaw. We didn't see any other boards moving in this direction. And the people had spoken. This was passed by 2/3 of the town meeting easily. And so what we decided to do was to form a working group and to invite other town boards to participate in the conversation. It's the friendly thing to do is to say, we'll take the lead and come join us. Well, the planning board joined us in September. And we had 6 meetings over 3 months, met twice a month, and we kicked around this proposed bylaw. Now, this proposed bylaw wasn't designed or developed at its inception in this town. Originally, it went to the town of Conway, where the AG turned it down because it was proposed as a general bylaw, which you can't do. This is clearly Section 40A, which falls under zoning and the planning board. The town of Shelburne last year voted this, and the AG approved it. So the planning board's attitude towards this is you can study anything to death. It's clearly a lot of effort has gone into this. FERCOG has assisted us, the planning director, and at their expense, the town council, because it's also the same legal entity, has gone through this. And this is very presentable, in my opinion, now. It doesn't mean it's cast in stone. What I suggest happen, I like this bylaw. I think it's very, very thorough. Does it have some flaws? Perhaps. Does it mean we shouldn't adopt it? I clearly think not. I think we should adopt it, and if there are changes, like there are in all bylaws, because bylaws are dynamic things, then it gets amended. So my suggestion is, I like it. I encourage our planning board, who are members of our working group, to accept it and to vote favorably, report favorably on it. And let's get it to the town meeting, and let's get it up there. It needs 2/3 of a vote to pass, because it's a zoning bylaw. And as we see shortcomings in it, let's amend those shortcomings over the years. But unlike Michael, and those were all very thoughtful comments, I appreciate that, Chair. I think the pressure on large-scale infrastructure is growing every day. In our current administration, state and federal, and I think we need to put a stake in the ground. And it needs to be, unlike the special permit situation, which is a process, this is a bylaw and is very public, and any developer would see this bylaw. Are there issues with it? There might be. But I encourage you to voice your support for this, bring it to town meeting, enact it, which you have the power to do, and move forward with it. So thank you for allowing me to speak.
David?
David Cole, Phillips Road. Are there any other members of the planning board that would like to share their specific concerns about this?
There's a couple of things, sure. Thank you for asking. This is Alan Rice for our recording. Michael's touched on one of them, which has to do with no mention of building inspector with any large bylaw. I like this bylaw too. I do think it needs more work. One of the things about writing bylaws is it enforceable? And so is this written in a way where elements can be, pieces of this can be adequately enforced by the process that's in place? I hear stories about, for example, wind turbines, other parts of the state where they've exceeded the ambient noise levels, and it's kind of like an oops. So are the penalty parts of this strong enough that this thing really means business, and if somebody violates something with this penalty, it doesn't stick to the rules and regulations of the bylaw, is that enforceable? The other thing that concerns me a little bit is, as I was reviewing this the other night, just for the heck of it, I came up with a list of all the submittal requirements an applicant would need to make in following this bylaw, and I've got close to 50. So it's either in the form of certifications or discussions or mapping, submittal copies of this, assurances of that, execution of this, conducting, obtaining permits, et cetera, and having this many elements that need to be submitted and reviewed obviously requires, it's beyond our means, it's beyond our resources. So that means that we would need to hire some kind of consultant, peer consultant, to review all these elements, and that's in this bylaw. But I want to make sure that that actually is something that the town can absolutely do, because I don't see how this board on a voluntary basis would be able to have the ability to review, or the select board for that matter, or other boards, have the ability to review all these required submittals. So I have a concern about that. And the other thing about that too is that even though we have the ability through this bylaw, if it's written correctly, to hire somebody paid for at the expense of the applicant, it still means that it's review that's one step removed from the town. When we sit on this board, we're citizens of the town. We live in the town. We hire somebody, they may not live in this town, and then we still have to review the results of the peer review. So I have some concerns about that. Those are the two main issues that I have with this, that I'd like to spend more time discussing and debating.
Can I make the follow-through with Dave's request? I sat on the board, as a member of the planning board with Ron and Rick Chandler and other members and went through this process. And personally, again, the planning board, such as Michael had mentioned, we haven't necessarily voted officially as to how this is all going to work for us. But my general feeling is to go along. I'm kind of with Ron in terms of the writing of this covers everything very well, and I kind of look at it. I go the simple way. We can make amendments in the future, and that's kind of what we probably will need to do with some of the concerns that Michael brought up and other concerns. So I'm sort of following through in terms of the time frame involved to get this done and the immediacy of having something like this to get done. The other thing too is that when this was being introduced to us, either Ron or Peggy Sloan, I can't recall exactly, but brought up the fact that other towns are doing this, like Shelburne for sure, Conway, and that the more towns put together gets more of a concern from the applicant. And that I believe Ron had brought up in one of our previous meetings, this is a draft from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And one of the things is the Commission encourages applicants to cooperate with state and local agencies regarding location, pipelines, siting, so on and so forth. Not all additional costs and delays, however, are unreasonable at the light of the Commission's goal to include state and local authorities. So the more of these that are around our area, the more, you know, the Federal Regulatory Commission, you know, will, you know, enforce those concerns of ours. So that's my general feeling, is to go along with this and then work on it in the future.
I would like to add in response to Ron, I appreciate the amount of effort that's gone into this, but page for page, there's been less effort spent on this bylaw in Ashfield than really any of our bylaws. We spent much longer on our telecommunications facilities that has gone into this. We spent much longer on our green subdivision stuff that still has to pass. We spent a lot longer on a senior thing. We spent a lot longer than this on our general bylaws. I think it's unrealistic for last September to say we're going to have a bylaw this complicated that's done and by town meeting next spring. And a lot of work has been done, but I think it needs a lot more work. So I appreciate the effort, but I also think we should appreciate the amount of effort that's gone into the bylaws that we have, because they do take a long time and a lot of thought to get it right. Sir?
I'm Bill Scaife, 81 Smith Road, and I have a couple comments. As far as enforcement goes, the last sentence under paragraph 15 stipulates that the appropriate officers or agents of the town are hereby authorized to issue a cease and desist notice. So I don't understand why the building inspector needs to be named. That might be a subject for a future amendment. But the select board and the planning board would certainly point to the appropriate officer. And one other point, I want to respond to what Alan said about the list of submittals and somewhere around 50. What's the alternative? And if this is modeled after what's been done in Shelburne and what is being done in Conway, they must have the same, approximately the same number of submittals that are required. But what's the alternative? If we want to make, if we want to adopt a bylaw that covers many or all of the possibilities, I think we're going to be stuck with having a long list of requirements. So I don't know what the logical conclusion is of saying there are too many. I mean, the mistake would be to have too few. And I just want to say that I'm with Ron Kohler. Even Supreme Court decisions are amended years after they're first decided. And towns amend bylaws. It's, as somebody said, I think Michael said, it's a living document. Or maybe Ron said that. It's there are going to need to be remedies for some of the areas that haven't been addressed, or some of the conflicts that may appear. But those are remedies that can be addressed in the future. With that, I'll
appreciate that. I was not implying that maybe we have too many submittal requirements here. I'm just simply pointing out, as I think is my responsibility as a member of this board, that there's a lot of submittals. And so I want to be sure that we have a mechanism in place that it's properly reviewed, that it's paid for accordingly, that the resources are available. I agree, something of this nature is going to have a lot of submittals. It should. But we need to be sure that the mechanisms are in place, that the peer review is done properly. And what does that entail? I think that's part of this bylaw that I'd like to see you focus on a little bit more and make sure that that's taken care of accordingly. I'm not trying to say this is way too many submittal requirements. That's not what I was meaning. So it's just a concern I have about the number of requirements that an applicant would have, how that gets processed, how it gets reviewed, and who does it. And then who does the final review, how does it get paid for? It's spelled out in here, but I still have my concerns about ensuring that that is actually the case.
It is a lot of submittals for a project of this size, and it might be that combining them just simply hasn't been thought out. And your point's well taken that it does say the appropriate officers or agents of the town are hereby authorized to issue a cease and desist notice. And I think that actually at this point means the building commissioner. I'm not authorized to do cease and desist notices. And as far as I know, I can't levy a fine. I don't have a badge. I'm been trained to do those things. The building commissioner, to my knowledge, is the one who does those things. And I would like to hear his opinion about how he would enforce this. I haven't. Or I would like to know who the other agents are that I don't know about. Yes, you can respond, and then I have two other people.
Quickly respond.
Just state your name again.
I'm Bill Skate, 81 Smith
Just for
Road.
the record.
Thanks. Assume the building inspector would enforce it the way he or she enforces any building code violations and issues a certificate of occupancy and so on. I don't see why this would be any different.
Well, I'd like to hear his opinion on it. I haven't. There was one in the back, and there was
Mr.
the
Chair?
over there.
Just a point of order. I just have a request. What we still have on the table is, A, to hear from each planning board member and hear any other responses. And B, I want to hear what other people have to say. So if it's always a call and response, if people say something and then you respond, or one or two of you respond, then we're not hearing the diversity of opinion that we're it's a public hearing. So my suggestion is if we could hear from the other planning board members and then hear from other people, write down the comments and then give your responses to the comments later so we can hear from everybody. Just my suggestion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure how I feel about that, Buzz. I think it's important to answer questions in the moment. And it's important to hear what everybody says, but it's a good point. And also, Jim, I'll back up because of that request. Did Jim have anything to add to what you feel about this?
I thought what Michael said was comprehensive and well representative of my thoughts on the current status of the draft. I also, because of my own experience in the whole pipeline issue in 2014, and also, involved with helping develop that resolution, I want to make sure that there's clarity on, what the thinking was around that resolution and other large-scale projects. And they're very different animals. What we faced at that time is a project that we absolutely had no control over. And this is set in law, federal law. So this proposed bylaw really is addressing large-scale development possibilities in the town of Ashfield, and not a project the likes of which we saw in 2014. And this is my personal view on it, the way those kinds of projects work, how they're approved, the relationship between industry and the government in getting those approvals, makes me very concerned about how we utilize what power we have as a community to have our voices heard. And of course, we saw that in action in lots of different ways, not just a bylaw. And again, that project was ended not because of a bylaw. It was ended because of a decision on the part of the company that wanted to build it. And they have their reasons. Some say that it was economical. I share that opinion, but there's more to it, I believe. But to suffice it to say that economics played a big role. So I just want to make sure for something of this magnitude, and this is big. This is a very big bylaw. It's a very complicated bylaw. And I'm not totally comfortable with putting something of this magnitude on the books, only to find out that there's a flaw in it. And yes, it's a living process. We can amend it. But if we have a failure, that failure could be significant. And the amendment to fix that failure is going to come after the failure occurs. So that was my fundamental concern with this, is that this is big, this is complex, this is a board, and I'm the newbie here. I don't have the level of expertise that my colleagues have on subjects like this, and I just felt for me personally, this is big, and I just felt that let's really make sure that we're crossing T's and dotting I's so that we really don't have to face that very unpleasant moment of like, oh wow, we missed something significant and it's going to hurt us. Not that that's going to happen, but that was my concern. So I'll end there, but to say that I do feel very comfortable with everything that everybody has stated so far.
Thank you. So Buzz, now we've heard from all four of us. Thank you for that. That was a good point. There was a hand in the back.
I'm all set.
Okay. And then there was Nina.
Nina Kohler, 168 Road. In 2014, we were deer in the headlights. We were all deer in the headlights. And in 2014, the citizens said, do something, help us do something. This is the something. It took us 4 years. And we get it in place, and then we give the planning board a mandate. Get cracking, rewrite this the way you want it, okay? But get something in place. I know the gas industry is changing, the price is going down, but you know what they want? They want to get it to the coast. They don't want to sell it to Boston, they don't want to sell it to us, they want to make money. And they're not going to go into solar. They're invested, they're going to get it to the coast, okay? They want it to go other places. So we need something in place. And a lot of folks here spent the summer down in Sandsfield. Sandsfield had no protection. They were told, we're going to come back and fix your roads and stuff. You can't even drive over that road now. The potholes will eat you alive. We watched as the summer progressed, and we couldn't even drive down that road anymore. And then they're gone. And they have not given that town any money to fix anything. So this is our chance, and FERC has said, you must respect the bylaws. Do everything you can to respect the bylaws. Let's get some bylaws up here, and then work on it. Thank you.
There was a hand over there a minute ago. Yes.
Jody Hall, Smith Road. I'm speaking in behalf of these bylaws. I recognize the fact of their being cumbersome and detailed, but they're addressing multiple issues, I think, for any large company or corporation that would come to this town. This is not, we're now moving on into this century, which is a century way different from the past, with 3 windmills going up on a hillside. I think we need to be ready for a large company or a large corporation to come to this town. I'm really impressed with the amount of work that's gone into these bylaws, the kind of detail that is addressing things like reconnaissance, determine impact on adjoining properties. And by the way, my understanding is that these bylaws do mandate that a company or corporation coming into town is responsible for paying for these experts. Correct me if I'm wrong about that, but so the public health safety aspect is being addressed, the hazardous material management, stormwater management, erosion and restoration, baseline environmental conditions, private wells. There's so much detail in here. And I too have I live in a family like many people in this room who maybe had some property through which this pipeline was going. I had a lot of dealings with this corporation as we were making our way and trying to really oppose what they're trying to do. And I developed absolutely no trust in a company like Kinder Morgan and Tennessee Gas. They absolutely do not have our interest in mind. We have got to put strong bylaws in place for such an entity to come into this town. I, for one, do not want to see fields filled with solar arrays. That's not why I live in Ashfield. Anyhow, I'm going to stop speaking now because I want to hear from other people. And I recognize there may be people who don't agree with me. That's my position.
I think you had your hand up before. Yes.
Rebecca Bradshaw, West Road. I'm sitting here noticing that we've waited 4 years since the resolution was passed in order for something to be put in place. That seems like a long time. And I'm also concerned that I haven't heard the planning board give any alternative timelines. I hear you saying this isn't good enough, but I haven't heard you say when and how it might be rewritten and when and how it might be voted on by the town. I'm concerned that we are vulnerable in the meantime. I'm not convinced Ned is dead. I think that they have all the surveying and they've done a lot of work. They could come back at any moment and decide to come back here. I also feel like if other towns around us are adopting these bylaws and we're not, that we're actually more vulnerable. That other towns, that the companies might say, okay, well, Ashfield, that's a good place to go. They don't have any bylaws like these other towns. And so I'm in favor of this going forward to the town meeting in May. And then I think that, as Nina said, if afterwards there's some rewriting to make it a little more coherent or something like that, great. But I feel like we're vulnerable the longer we wait. Yeah, I'm with Jody. I don't trust those companies for anything. So thank you.
And then behind the pillar.
David Chandler, 350 Main Street. I'd like to hear the chairman or anybody else on the board address address specifically your thoughts on whether you see any particular risks or downsides to following the process that Ron suggested of going ahead and adopting this bylaw in its present form with the assumption that whatever flaws, whatever problems it may have can be addressed over time through amendments. Do you see any risks or dangers, any legal exposure in following that process? Or should we just go ahead with the assumption that even though it may be flawed and may need changes, that passing it now would at least give us some incremental degree of extra protection that we wouldn't otherwise have?
Thank you, David. That's a question. I'll answer it. My opinion is there's slight risk both ways. There's a risk that somebody with deep pockets will exploit a flawed bylaw and build something large here. I think it's a very remote risk. There's also a risk that if we don't get this in place, the pipeline might come back, and they're not bound by these rules in any case, but they wouldn't be influenced by these rules. So I think it's also important to note that after over a century of utilities having these sorts of powers, and in my opinion, what a utility is today is a perversion of the original intent. They're supposed to be public service corporations, and they're not anymore. We're breaking new ground. We're writing zoning laws that are intended to influence utilities despite the fact that state law says we can't. That's what we're doing. And to do that in 4 years or 6 months or 8 years, I typically take a better late than wrong attitude towards planning. Because being wrong means you have something in place and you did it that didn't work. And I've had a few things that didn't quite work in my planning career. I've been on the board almost 20 years and lived to regret those. They were much smaller things than what might be wrong here. And then, I forgot your name.
Ben Martin. Ben Martin, 597 Dulles Road. First of all, thank you for agreeing to have a meeting on Wednesday, so folks who might have been disenfranchised can speak. I would hope you would accept written comments as well, if that's allowed. Because I know some people who can't.
It's required that we accept.
Oh, good. So I think we should bring it to town meeting as well. In 2014, Tom Carter said to me, we have to trust the town. And I trust the town, so I think we should bring it to the town. And I appreciate that this is not perfect, but sometimes perfect is the enemy of good enough. And this may be good enough. And I think that what I know today, I'm going to say yes at town meeting. But thank you.
Then there were, you were here. I can't keep track. You're going to have to do a sign-up sheet for talking. I think it was Tamsin was next.
Yes, I'd like to say that I'm
Can you just state your full name?
Tamsin Darrell, Creamery Road. I'd like to say that I'm also in favor of these bylaws coming to vote at our annual town meeting. They have been worked on to a great degree, and I would assume that any amendments can be added later. I'd just like to clarify, have these bylaws not been approved at this point by the Attorney General of the state of Massachusetts? I believe they have been, they've passed inspection. Could I direct that question to the select board? Remember?
Yeah, I think Ron can speak to that.
Yes, they have been approved with minor comment from the AG last September, I believe.
And how many edits have we done since then?
We haven't counted, but we took into account the edits that the Attorney General put forth. There were a number of them.
Passing a sign-up sheet so you get it.
Peter was next.
I also agree that we should bring this up. Peter Collins, Eldenville Road, sorry. I also agree it should be brought up
I'd like to add one additional point in response to what the woman from West Road said, and that if we don't pass this, we're weakening the surrounding town's power, because if there's a town missing, it makes it much easier for the company or the power company to come in. For instance, they could put a compressor station here, and if we're not in consolidation with all the rest of the towns, it weakens everybody, not just us. And then I have a specific comment on the bylaw, and the penalties in the bylaw seem to me to be fair rather than act as a deterrent. For instance, if I cut down a tree on somebody else's land, I'm responsible for 3 times the value of the tree. But here, basically, the company can do nothing, and if we try to enforce it, well, there's no penalty. They'll just pay what it costs us to enforce it. So I'd like to see the penalty strengthened.
I believe that the $300 per day that is the penalty is set by state law for zoning violations. I could be wrong about that, but last I knew that was how much we could do. And then in back, I've got a list for management by the grade.
Steady aid. And I'm, first of all, grateful to you folks on the Planning Commission for the study and the work that you put into it along with the Select Board. And very conscious of the idea that often perfection does get in the way of progress. And that ties into the gratitude, because if you've already been able to identify what some of the flaws are, then that suggests to me that they ought to be fixable in reasonably near term. You've probably all heard lots of stories about some of the indignities that happened with the pipeline, but you may not know mine. We, up until January, only operated Steady Lane Farm. And I was surprised one day to get a call from a friend who said, if you go to the library and look at the plan, you'll see that 24 acres of your land are going to be taken as a staging area. And that land is protected for agricultural purposes. And it was going to be taken anyway. So not only would it violate the protection that land has already acquired, it was going to knock us out of business, because that was a large enough chunk of hay ground and pasture ground that we couldn't operate. So I'm very much in support of the idea of let's move this ahead now, and let's also do a really important, careful job of vetting it so that we can make the improvements that are needed.
Mark Burton?
Yes, right here. Mark Burton, Beldingville Road. I want to say that the work that you've done on this, the analysis that you've done, I think is tremendous, and I have a great deal of respect for it. And I would see that as part of the future amendments to the bylaw. But I would just ask you if you would not mind answering a hypothetical question, and which is, if for some reason those amendments were not able to be made in the future, are we better off today not having this at all? Or would you support having this as opposed to nothing else?
Well, that's a good question, and one of the purposes of public hearings is to help us make up our minds about what the constituents think. I would say that I'm not sure how I feel one way or the other. I'm not sure whether it's a very common planning concept that once you publish something like this, you're making a blueprint for development, that a developer can use these things. I used the example of the quarter-mile setback from large-scale industrial. If this goes in and we get a wind turbine thing, and we want to put a 3/4-mile setback on them, it would be then difficult for us to do that. I don't think we're going to get a wind turbine thing, because we don't have enough wind in Ashfield for a big enough location. But I personally am hung on that issue, which is is okay, because the voters are going to do what they want after they listen to me anyways. So, you know, and if this goes through, I will keep working on these edits, and there may be a replacement bylaw that shows up next time. If it doesn't go through, I will keep working on these edits anyways. But literally, one of these sections that I talk about can take half an hour or an hour of discussion in a planning board meeting. What about outdoor concerts? What about trail systems? We could talk about trail systems and outdoor recreation and how that's affected by this for an hour easily. Peter Curtis already spoke, I thought. Yes, he did.
Not always.
Oh, wrong Peter. Sorry, I don't know your last name.
Are you recognizing me?
I am.
My name is Peter Curtis out of Honolulu. So there are a couple of things I'd like to point out. One of them is that we have a president who is very different than anything I've ever seen in my life. We have our own governor who is speaking out of both sides of his mouth about liking gas as a bridge fuel, which we know it's not. And I think that those are two things we got to keep in mind, because we're not going to have help from the federal government. We're not going to have help from FERC. We're not going to have help from our own governor. I think we need to stand up and make this thing happen as soon as possible, and then immediately start the process of cleaning up the issues, Michael, that you have mentioned that need some work. Not putting them off for some future date and sitting back on our laurels thinking that we've done as much as we can do. But work on it right away so that we do have the energy to put it in place and then follow through with what we have. So I'm very much in favor of adopting this as it stands at town meeting, and then immediately putting into place the process by which we can identify those issues, Michael, that you raised. Thank you.
Then it was Tom Minor.
Thank you. Thomas Minor, 243 Main Street. I'll be brief, as so many have echoed what I would also say, especially Ben and Nord and Peter, in that perfection should not get in the way of progress, and especially echoing Peter's sentiments of immediately following up if there are things that need to be amended and not delaying it for another 4 years as it's been since the original, since the citizenry spoke originally. And thank you to the select board and the planning board for all of it.
Diane. I got you after I get through this list.
Diane Sibley.
Yes.
North Farmwood Road. I just feel strongly that we should bring this to town meeting, read the bylaw. I think we made a commitment to the citizens in 2014. We have to follow through. I disagree that there is not an urgency to act on this. I think that we, as Ron said, do need to put a stake in the ground.
Okay, thank you, Anna.
Anna Fessenden, 43 South Street. I just want to say, first of all, I am basically the person who wrote the resolution with a team of people who then we sat down for a couple of weeks and revised it and submitted it. The thing that drove me to write that thing was actually more what happened with the wind turbines and then comparing that to what happened with the pipelines. And we had the same scenario where a huge corporation comes in, they hang tags on our doorknobs, that's how we hear about it. And it immediately causes a huge divide and split in the community. My point in writing it was to avoid that ever again, that they have to first come to you, that we have a channel. And I think it's extremely dangerous, especially considering, as someone, I think it was you, Jim, who said, considering the climate politically right now that is very pro-fracking, very pro-pipeline, can't risk another week of not having something in place, let alone more years to decide. And then I just want to address each of the board members' comments briefly. Michael, you said that it's just not possible to regulate utilities. They just run roughshod, I think was your word. I agree totally. But that brings us to really, what is our goal? Is it to try to regulate them, or is it try to obstruct them? Personally, I'm just going to continue doing what I did from 1914, 2014, to obstruct these guys, slow them down, do whatever we can. And because we can amend this later, I just don't think it's an issue, to address your comment, Jim, that what if we have a failure? What if we put something in this that fails us? To me, that's like saying, I live in an extremely dangerous neighborhood, but, you know, I'm not going to get any kind of weapon because it might fail on me. I mean, it's nuts. We just have to have some kind of protection. So again, I think the only other thing I want to address is, Michael, you said it was a unanimous decision from the board. But Ken, I was hearing from you more that you were okay with it. And I just wonder if we could clarify that. Maybe I didn't get it.
Sure. We had a vote, and we all agreed that we had more work to do.
Okay.
That's the nature.
So you took an
of
action.
And Ken was the most reluctant voter on that, as he indicated. But I think Ken can nonetheless find a few things in here that he wants to change too.
And if I could add one more thing. We talk a lot about the 50 submittals, I think is the word, that the applicant has to go through, and how that could be problematic, not only for them, but for the town to try to, I think that was one of your points, Ellen, for the town to try to deal with all those things. Personally, I see 50 submittals as powerful, extremely powerful, and not a negative. So I'm in favor of this coming for a vote, obviously.
Sure.
I've noticed some people are leaving for the day. If you are leaving and you haven't signed in, just make sure you sign in. Ted, you want to maybe this right by you? Right by your head.
What's the purpose of the sign?
Just for public use. Also to come after you.
We missed somebody's name. If we miss somebody's name in the minutes, we can go to the sign-up sheet and puzzle it out. It helps us practice things. Then Mary Link is next.
Mary Lynch, 48 Buckland Road. I also hope that we will move forward with what we have and work quickly to amend it later, as others have stated. I think we need to honor the citizen request and petition that Anna and others worked on, and 2/3 of the town voted on. Other towns have already vetted this through the Attorney General's office, so we know that, that most of what's here is okay on that level. We can keep working on the full limit as we move forward. And I think some of the pieces, Anna talked about notes hanging on doors, and I think that one of the pieces, and we saw this, I spent a lot of my summer in Sandusfield, where there is a pipeline in the ground now, and there are roads full of potholes, and there are people who, have pipelines through their backyards that they didn't want there. And we saw with the Ned pipeline that people got picked off, and part of what this bylaw gives us is that the town needs to be notified if anything is coming through, so that it goes to the town, and the town doesn't find out, and the rest of us don't find out, because one of the neighbors gets, picked at here and there, and that some people get offered, here, I'm going to give you $1 million if I can go through your yard, and I'm going to give you $1 million if I go through your yard, and picking people off here and there. This one of the things that protects us as a town and protects us as individuals. And that's important, and there are things in here also, people's in gas pipelines all over the place, people have lost their water, and we have a water district in this town, but we also have a lot of private wells, and this includes testing of wells at the expense of the company before they do anything. There are places where there is, in fracking situations where people turn on their faucet now and they can light what comes out and it burns. And the companies say, oh, it always was like that. We didn't do that. But this requires the testing to be done before they do anything so that at their expense, that all our water sources can be tested ahead of time and then continually tested. Those kinds of things are incredibly valuable, even if there are problems in the rest of it, little places here and there that need to be improved. And I can hear that and see that there are places that need to be improved, and I totally, respect your, your brilliant brain and your good thinking and your 20 years of experience and all the other experience on the board to go through this with that kind of fine-tooth comb. And I trust that you're going to keep working on it for us after we pass this, assuming that the town does pass it. And I want to see it go forward. And I saw the town of Sandusfield also, much littler town than us, get bullied. And they only didn't get bullied as hard as they might have been bullied because a whole lot of activists showed up. And at their first hearing with their Conservation Commission with Kinder Morgan there, Kinder Morgan kind of looked and saw 40 people who fought Ned walk into this tiny, tiny little town. And they were like, oh, okay, well, we're going to have more of a fight here than we thought. We can't just run shot over this. But had they had this kind of bylaw there, their town roads would be being paid for to repair like they were told in advance they would, but they didn't have any protection. They had minimal protection in place, and they got nothing. And so I want to see us have some protections in place and stand with our neighboring towns, and I want to see this come up for a vote. Thank you.
Gordy Van Gilder.
Hi, Gordy Van Gilder, 385 Hudson Road. The pipeline can't come very close to my house. I had a lot of concerns about it. I'd like to see something in place now. I listened to the discussion on risk. It sounds to me like the risk is much less for the person on getting something in place and fixing later. Thank you for support that.
Thank you.
Bob
Barlow.
West Road.
Yes.
Just very briefly, because I'm echoing what a lot of folks have said, I want to thank the boards that brought this to us today. I really appreciate the work. I know what it's like to have a bunch of people stand up in the room and volunteer you for even more work. So it just seems to me that a lot of what I heard in terms of reservations were organizational, and those organizational issues seem less critical to me than, so it feels like, I don't know what the requirements are in terms of the timeline for annual town meeting, but it feels like there's some way to identify those really critical elements that could expose us in any way, and those sounded minimal to me, and really work on those. And then I appreciate that there's a lot of organizational work, but that didn't sound to me like the kind of work that could expose us. So I'm very much in favor of, as Ron said, putting the stake in the ground, working on it, and just a suggestion that there's got to be a core group of things that we can work on more quickly and address those. I'm very much in favor of bringing it to annual town meeting. Thanks.
And just to be clear on my earlier comments, there's a lot of organizational things. It's true. And we attempted to have this bylaw come as a one-year bylaw so that we would have time to work on these things. But the one thing that I did say that I want to emphasize is that if there's some large-scale developer that wants to do things the way it's published in here and they come to town, we have no protection at all under this bylaw for whatever that is. I don't know what that is, but as planning board chairman, I really have to point out to the voters that that's the underbelly of this. This would certainly have an effect on any pipeline developer. There's no denying that, and that's what's in front of us now. But In 2011, were we thinking about pipelines? In 2008, were we thinking about wind turbines? No, I don't know what we're not thinking about now. But to go on, Harry Dodson's next.
Harry Dodson, South Street. Given the political climate in Washington now, I think it's important to move ahead quickly. The tar sands pipeline in the Dakotas.
Keystone. I think it was the Keystone.
Yeah. That is moving ahead now because of the new administration. I think it's really important to move ahead quickly. I recognize the concern about getting all the details right. I think the most important details are the ones to get right so it passes the Attorney General review. I would do that. I would double check that as soon as possible, maybe in another meeting or two, maybe get somebody who knows what they're looking for to make sure it passes AG review. And then bring it to town meeting in the spring and make further adjustments to it in the future. But I think it's important to move ahead quickly.
And Brian Clark.
Yeah, Brian Clark, Apple Valley. The concern I came up with after reviewing it is that it appears, one portion of it appears to try and regulate wind turbines, and those are, I think, are kind of a special, besides being not a fossil fuel issue, as a renewable energy facility, they have a very special and complex requirements for sighting and sound and visual issues set back. Michael has touched on that a little bit earlier, and I think it's a mistake. What's in there now is just kind of a partial thing, and it's not, in my opinion, is very overly restricted. It would prevent the sighting of the turbines at Berkshire East and Jiminy Peak, for example, because they are overly restricted. The sound requirement of 35 decibels. I went out on my deck early at 5:30 this morning with a commercial sound meter, and the sound on my deck just from Apple Valley Brook is 45 decibels, just to put that in a little context. I think it's a mistake to try and roll that into this thing. I think that the wind turbine thing is such a specialized and complicated issue. It needs to have its own, if we're going to do something with those, it needs to be done as a separate bylaw with a separate process to do it, as we did for photovoltaic panels back in 2012, for example. That's my concern with the way this currently stands.
Okay, I would, for clarity, I would like to comment on that, is that we had a wind turbine commission and researched what you're talking about. And because of the lack of resource locally, it never came to town meeting. But right now, all structures in Ashfield that aren't educational, telecommunications, or agriculture are limited to 50 feet. So essentially, commercial wind turbines are illegal here right now under our zone. And we decided to leave that in place, and that is our wind turbine law at this point. Jenny Merkins?
Jenny Markins, 597 Dulles Road. Just to add to the sense of urgency about this, some of you are probably aware of something called investor-state trade disputes. And those are being discussed as part of our trade policies, whereby a foreign company can sue a town if they try to address their environmental issues for lost profits, as I understand it. This has been a small piece of these trade instruments being talked about internationally, and there's a lot of support for this in both parties. We have an enormous amount of foreign countries buying up property, investing in gas and oil, a lot of things, and they trade ownership like playing cards. So I feel a very strong sense of urgency to take some steps to protect our community, because we may not have another window to do that. And if something comes at us, we may be absolutely powerless if we don't have something.
Eric Nelson?
Eric Nelson, Buildingville Road. Mr. Chairman, I would ask that and request that the chair call for a show of hands of voters in the room that would be inclined to vote positive on this bylaw if it was brought to the town meeting.
Okay. We're going to have a show of hands. So I'd like to also ask for a show of hands of people that don't think they would vote.
Bud Eisenberg, as the town moderator, I abstained because I would be presiding over the vote. No, let's not make that out.
And I should have asked for abstention.
He abstained because he wasn't presiding over.
And we're going to continue this on Wednesday night. So, yes.
Amy Shapiro, Stonewall Drive. Since some of these other towns have passed this, are they already working on amendments and have come up with their tweaks? And are we in communication with them so that we can also learn from what their process is?
Was there another hand? Yes, sir.
Mark Burton, Beldingville Road. I'm not a student of town government, so I apologize. Could you just tell me what's at stake in this meeting relative to getting this before town meeting? What is the process that we're going through here?
We are having a hearing within 65 days of the select board's request and more than 21 days before town meeting. The planning board is required to, within 21 days from this hearing, submit a recommendation to the select board, which has no influence, no power over whether the select board puts this on the warrant or not. I believe they're putting it on the warrant anyways. So I'm wrong to assure me this is going to town meeting. It's a legal requirement that we have a public hearing within the time frame, and that's what we're doing today. And the planning board will write some sort of report over the next few weeks for the town meeting to have. Yes?
Lisa Burton, Beldingville Road. I just have two questions. Since this is going, can you make your tweaks to this that you've been discussing prior to bringing it to the town meeting? And also, if it does pass as a bylaw and they're working on more tweaks afterwards, fixing things up, if a company comes in and wants to and submits an application for a project, and then we change bylaws later, are they grandfathered in to the prior version?
Yes, they would be grandfathered into the prior version if they apply for the permit under whatever it is the current law.
And can you make some tweaks that you had wanted prior to, no, so that it's the way that it is currently is?
We can only make tweaks that are less restrictive than what's been published.
Okay.
And then you get into the semantics of what is restrictive. I'm pretty sure we will ask that the definitions be moved to the definitions section, and that the pre-application conference be moved to the special permit section. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get much else other than that done. I think that the consultants section is actually flawed. It probably was written with information before the state jumbled around what we're supposed to do. I don't really know that, I just know it doesn't say stuff that is in the copy of what we're supposed to pass. About what kind of account you're going to have and how you're going to pay it out and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't really say that in there. So I'd like to see that move, but I don't think we can move it. And we certainly aren't going to have time to deal with like the outdoor recreation stuff and the other issues that I brought up in this. It was Ron, then Mary, then...
So just a point of information, this is in the planning board's purview right now, as Michael said, the 21 days. If they issue a report favorable, and I don't know what that really means, but if it's favorable with a few edits, and it does not, and it comes to the town meeting floor, and it doesn't pass, it can come to next year's town meeting again. If they issue a report that is unfavorable, that's how the zoning article is written, and it comes to town meeting floor and is not passed, you have to wait 2 years. So that's just information.
I'd like to correct that.
Okay, thank you.
It cannot come to town meeting for 2 years unless we issue a further report after a hearing that is in favor of it. We can change our mind about that within 2 years. That is to prevent developers from harassing us with the same bylaw every 6 months, that law is. If the planning board recommends it, re-recommends it, we can do that within 2 years. And, yes?
It's Rebecca Bradshaw again from West Road.
Sorry.
I forgot to say that I really appreciated the extreme detail that you went into and the time you took to go over that and all the points that you came up with. Even though I wanted to go forward, I really appreciate that and look forward to your mind and how it works with this being part of further amendments.
All right, thank you, Mary.
So just to more than that, clarify your process, these process questions. With some things we can make amendments on the floor of town meeting, but so because this is a bylaw, so are you talking about changes that you can make as long as they're less, like you can move sections around before they come to annual town meeting?
After the hearing, before town meeting, we may not make a bylaw more restrictive than what was presented to the hearing. We can make it less restrictive. Sometimes the semantics on what's restrictive are such that we just keep our hands off of it. Buzz, we can amend anything on town meeting floor though, right? As long as it's within the subject matter. So that's...
So my question then is one of the pieces that seems to come up again and again that seems to be the most, one of the critical pieces is this piece about consultants, and wondering whether that would be something that you could bring an amendment to the floor and it could be already taken care of if that was amended on town meeting.
Yeah, I thought of that too.
So that would be possible.
Mr. Chair.
I didn't know whether there was something special about
I have
bylaws.
to ask Buzz on the details of that because the actual language I'm looking at, the consultants the state wants us to use, appears to be somewhat more restricted in some ways than what's in here. And I would propose adding it to a different section of bylaws, and I'm really not sure how the moderator, and I wouldn't blame him if he didn't want to answer that today.
I can answer generally without specifics, just by saying as long as it's within the scope of what people were noticed we were going to be talking about. If it's a matter of moving it to a different section or changing it, morphing it into something that people were alerted to we're going to be discussing. Obviously, if we morphed it to something that had nothing to do with industrial and commercial large-scale development, then that would be out of order because we weren't prepared to do it. So
Like what happens in Congress, we wouldn't allow in Ashfield.
I'm just still standing because I didn't identify myself on Mary Lake 48 Bucking Road. Still.
Thank you. There was a hand over there. Brian.
Yeah, Brian Clark, Apple Valley. Just a question, this can also be handled in a special town meeting? Or is it restricted to
No, this would be a special town meeting.
could be done in a special town, so this can actually be done any time of the year in a conjunction with a special town meeting.
I would think that we might have some edits in the fall coming to town meeting, based on this hearing and what I know about this and how long we spend doing things. Yes, anyone else? David.
David Fessenden, South Street. I've always had a concern that we throw out the baby with the bathwater sometimes and discourage small industry, which I know, Ashfield more and more is becoming a bedroom community, if the pardon the expression. And if we return to our historical paths where South River was littered with mills, the blacksmith shop on South Street would never be tolerated, all that racket there. And also, there's some things that may fit our sensitivities, like a nice riding, which is not agricultural, by the way. We'd have to be, their big building for winter riding would have to fit in there. So, and there's a risk that we ran into when I was a conservation committee on that board, was that if we make those exceptions for something, if we did it on that board, say, well, he's a very much, well, I'd cut a few trees down in the beaver pond there, because we know he's good. You set yourself up, if somebody big comes in and says, hey, this is not fair, which it isn't, of course. So if a law is made, I think we have to live by it 100%, and it's going to have an effect on us. And part of the reason it was brought up in the other meeting, which I think is valid, it's a public safety thing, which is concerned. It may sound small, but the fire chief has a hard time getting enough young guys to respond to fires in the daytime because they're working in Springfield, Greenfield, and so forth. And I'm curious if, before you guys were split on this, have you all maintained that same thing, or are you all in agreement now? I'm not sure about that. And a question I probably could look up, but are amendments required to have a 2/3 majority the same way as this would?
5 days.
5 days.
And what are you asking?
Oh, and you were split on this before.
On what?
Oh, on whether your authority, in other words, things are okay the way that you guys would have the ability when these kind of operations come to town. And maybe I misunderstood what you said on that, but there was a split vote on some kind of situation. In other words, the permit process is adequate now. We don't need further. And also, I fear a little bit the really big companies that we want to keep out. This is, it's small change for them. It's the cost of doing business, pass it on to your customers.
I don't think we're so much split as we haven't arrived at a consensus. Well, we try to be 100% together on everything we propose to town meeting, because that's the surest way of coming up with something that will work for everyone in town, to have all 5 of us. And it's remarkable to me how when all 5 of us are really solid on something, town meeting kind of just totally approves what we say. It's democracy shrunk down to 5 representatives. We're largely a legislative board. So what I think you're remembering is that we really haven't discussed a lot of these details in deep to where we have a consensus about what we want to do about, say, outdoor recreation. Because this is a blueprint for large-scale development, it can be looked at as an invitation to have large-scale development in Ashfield. I've spent my volunteer career on this post actively planning small-scale development. That's what's going on before I joined. It's a little weird for me to actually put out a law that says, well, if you want to build something really big in Ashfield, this is how you do it. Because as soon as you have a subdivision control law, all the subdividers are going to read it and say, well, do I want to buy land there and develop it? We spent over a year rewriting our subdivision control law. And that's a relevant point, that back in the 70s, subdivision control regulations in town were put in place that were relatively onerous. They were requiring 1.5-foot gravel, wide roads. And the thought was that this was going to discourage subdivisions. We still got 1.5 subdivisions under those laws, despite the fact that they seem to be too expensive for anybody to bother with. And that's what I'm afraid of, is something I don't know here that's going to want to move to town under these laws. I don't know what it is. I can't imagine what it is, or I haven't yet. But that's why I'm being very careful about saying I support this, because on the one hand it reads like this is going to really discourage pipelines from coming. On the other hand, it reads as a recipe for the kind of thing that we're not really planning on having. Courts look at outright bans as discrimination. They are, but if you actually write laws saying this is the kind of thing I want to have, like we have a bunch of stuff for small business in our bylaws, and for small residential developments, and we've been getting that kind of thing as a result of this, more so perhaps than surrounding towns. So, does that answer your question?
It does.
Okay. Tamsin.
Yes, I just need to read this statement that Walt Konofsky asked me to read. Walter Konofsky from Buckle, thank you. As a land planner and landscape architect, one-time Ashfield Planning Board member, and someone who has originated mass zoning bylaws, I recommend the passage of the bylaw with whatever additional detailed scrutiny it may be given. The FERCog and Select Board and Planning Board have placed a fine bill before us. I do not hold out too much hope that it can make a lot of difference with the federal and state corrupted system in which it operates, but as Round Kohler said at the recent open meeting, this bylaw will require applicants to engage in a more robust conversation with the town, and they will know we care and are watching. So that's from Walt Konofsky.
Thank you.
Is that something you can submit?
Anyone else want to speak? All talked out. It's not even noon yet. You guys get to have lunch. So, thank you. Thank you. Do I hear a motion?